Well, I think we need a little historic experience, and the experience I would put forth is really think back to the Cold War. Our relationship with China was really responsible for the two biggest hot wars of the Cold War, Korea and Vietnam. And once Richard Nixon went to China, and then President Carter in 1979 January established formal relations, we established a new relationship with China, and we've had in excess of 40 years of peace and massive economic growth. And China really now accounts for more than a third of global growth. So I would say the first lesson is that a productive, that doesn't always mean friendly, and that doesn't always mean frictionless, but a productive relationship with China is really essential for the global economy and world peace. And so at the same time, we now see all the frictions and difficulties with China, which are real and need to be addressed. Nonetheless, we need to recognize how far we've come. Well, let us be clear here. I think that Xi Jinping is not only somewhat of a surprise to Americans, given the history of the preceding leadership. You had really Mao, Deng, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, four Chinese administrations that headed in the direction of greater social liberalization in China and economic reform. And Xi Jinping is a surprise not only to the Americans, but also to many Chinese. And so I think we have to recognize that Xi Jinping is leading China in a fundamentally different direction than it's been moving in the last 4+ decades. This represents a problem, and therefore, how do we handle him? Well, of course, in the end, we're not the sole determinant. The Chinese people have to, produce their own leaders and handle them. But we will have to deal with him, and I think we need to be clear about what our interests are. It should not be containing China or trying to slow it down or somehow waging economic war against the Chinese people. It ought to be defining our own interests and pushing for those interests. And I think we could define those as reciprocity, fairness, and meeting global standards. Well, I think you would have to judge certainly in terms of American interests, but I would say also regional interests of the countries around China and the global system, that the current trajectory is not good. China's being more assertive, less respectful of the interests of those around it, and it has certainly not been terribly respectful of American economic interests and so forth. The debate in the United States is not really over whether we like China's trajectory or we don't. I don't think there are many Americans that see it moving in a positive direction right now. And in fact, many Chinese don't see it moving in a positive direction. But the issue is how we can effectively articulate our interests, push back to recognize and achieve our interests without producing a totally counterproductive situation of greater conflict and economic war. Of course, China's a big, complicated country, and in reality, it's going in many directions at the same time. We focused in these remarks on Xi Jinping and the direction he's leading. There are many Chinese that have become invested in a more liberal, more open, more cooperative China. And I think if we play our cards right, those more productive impulses will reappear in China. Whether it's a decade from now, a week from now, that I'm not really able to say. But there are people in China that think the past 4 administrations in China and the last 8 administrations in the United States were moving in a productive direction, and I haven't lost all hope that that will restore itself.